In the winter of 1883, nestled deep in the snowbound hollows of West Virginia, something happened that would tear a quiet religious community apart and challenge the very foundation of what its people believed about God, science, and the mind of a child. His name was Elias Dorne. He was only 9 years old when he stood up in the middle of a Sunday service at Briar Hollow's Presbyterian Chapel and spoke in a voice that wasn't quite his own. He spoke of blood in the stone, of crows warning of danger, and of 19 souls that would be spared from the darkness. 3 days later, a coal shaft outside the nearby industrial town of Marlow collapsed. 27 men were killed, but 19, exactly 19, were pulled out alive. The story was suppressed, as many such stories are. Authorities feared panic, ridicule, or worse, lawsuits. It wasn't until nearly a century later, in 1971, that a collection of personal journals was uncovered in a locked trunk during the demolition of an old boarding house in Charleston. Letters, sermons, physicians' notes, all pointing to one unexplainable truth. A child had predicted a mining disaster down to the very minute number of survivors without any possible way of knowing. This isn't just a ghost story. It's a historical case that both neurologists and theologians have studied and still cannot fully account for. At the center of it all is a boy whose mind operated beyond the rules of the world he was born into. Elias's visions were witnessed by no fewer than 51 individuals. Miners, clergy, a traveling physician, and even a U.S. deputy marshal whose report was quietly buried in the archives of the state capitol. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. Most people look away when history gets uncomfortable. But we don't. Not here. Here we shine light on the forgotten corners of the American past. Places where belief and reality collided and left scars. So, if you're ready to follow us down into the shadows of Briar Hollow, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments what state or country you're listening from. You might want to keep the lights on for this one, because this story doesn't begin with Elias's prophecy. It begins with a forgotten road, a murdered family, and a decision that would haunt one man for the rest of his life. Briar Hollow wasn't on most maps. Even by Appalachian standards, it was remote, just a handful of wooden cabins strung along a narrow ridge line where the mountains folded in on themselves like clasped hands in prayer. The only road in was barely wide enough for a wagon, and after the first snowfall, most residents knew better than to expect visitors until spring. The community had been founded in 1869 by Reverend Abel Pike, a former Union chaplain who led a small flock of Presbyterians westward after the war, searching for something purer than what they believed the cities could offer. They built their church first, always the church, and then cabins, a schoolhouse, and a modest infirmary. What they lacked in worldly comforts, they made up for in faith and self-reliance. Silas and Miriam Dorne were among the first families to settle there. He was a blacksmith with a quiet way about him. She a healer and midwife with hands that smelled of thyme and crushed lavender. For years they tried and failed to have children. 3 miscarriages, a stillbirth. The townsfolk spoke of it in whispers, as if even sorrow was something that should be handled delicately. So when Silas returned from a hunting trip one spring morning in 1874 with a child bundled in buffalo hide, no one asked too many questions. Not at first. Silas had gone westward beyond the foothills, tracking a wounded buck. What he found instead were the smoldering remains of a woodland encampment, 3 shelters reduced to ash, and a scent in the air that didn't belong to any animal. Gunpowder, burned flesh, the unmistakable copper tang of spilled blood. The camp had belonged to a small group of Monongahela natives, those who still resisted the forced relocations, clinging to sacred land their ancestors had worshipped for centuries. What Silas saw was not the aftermath of a skirmish. It was a massacre. There were no survivors, not above ground, anyway. He found the boy hidden in a shallow stone chamber beneath one of the collapsed shelters. It wasn't a cellar exactly, more like a ceremonial alcove lined with carvings and strewn with tokens, bird skulls, feathers, bundles of dried herbs. The child was wrapped tightly and had not uttered a sound. His eyes were wide open, watching. He was by Silas's estimation around 1.5 years old, too young to speak clearly, but old enough to walk, and old enough to remember perhaps what had happened above him. The boy was unharmed, but the scene haunted Silas. The adults had been bound before they were killed. Some bore marks that suggested torture, and the soil had been disturbed as if someone had been digging, searching for something. Silas hesitated. He told no one, not the authorities and Marlowe, not even his wife, not at first. He buried the bodies beneath cairns of stone, whispering what prayers he could manage for the dead he didn't know. And he brought the child home. He and Miriam told the town that they'd found the boy abandoned near an old trail marker likely left by travelers passing through. In the mountains, such stories weren't uncommon. And in a place like Briar Hollow, where every child was viewed as a divine gift, no one wanted to ask questions that might spoil a miracle. They named him Elias, baptized him within the week. And if the boy sometimes cried out in his sleep in a language Miriam didn't recognize, or stared too long at empty corners of the cabin, or flinched at the sound of metal on stone, well, that was grief. And grief was understandable, especially for a child who'd known loss before he knew language. But Elias wasn't like other children. Even as a toddler, he could sense when storms were coming hours before the sky darkened. He always knew where to find lost things, needles, keys, tools, and once led Miriam directly to a neighbor's child who'd gone missing in the woods. He pointed wordless, and they followed. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He was solemn, watchful, and the older he grew, the more the other children began to keep their distance. They said he could hear things no one else could. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of a lesson and tilt his head as if listening to some distant inaudible whisper carried on the wind. Miriam once joked that he was touched by spirits, but as they would soon learn, she wasn't wrong. February 18, 1883. It was a Sunday unlike any other in Briar Hollow. Not for the weather, though the air was sharp and brittle, and snow hung heavy on the pine boughs, but for what would unfold inside the narrow cedar-frame church at the center of town. The pews were packed, 43 adults and 20 children, all bundled in wool and huddled close around the cast-iron stove that glowed faintly at the front. Reverend Pike stood at the pulpit, his voice strong and sonorous, speaking of trials and tribulations of Job's endurance in the face of suffering. Outside the mountains loomed silent and white. Inside, faith wrapped itself around the room like steam. Elias Dorne sat in the third pew beside his adoptive mother, Miriam. Silas had remained home with a strained back, but Miriam insisted the boy should be among his community. She noticed something different about him that morning. Something in the way he stared, unmoving at the altar. His pale grey eyes seemed fixed on something beyond the church walls. Reverend Pike was midway through a passage about divine justice when Elias stood. The movement was sudden but not startled, not the fidget of a restless child. He rose as if summoned. The wooden bench beneath him creaked, and a hush fell so swiftly it swallowed the sermon mid-sentence. Elias walked slowly to the center aisle, his arms loose at his sides. His face held no fear, only a strange, distant calm. He stopped at the midpoint of the church and turned toward the congregation. Then in a voice that was his, and yet not, he spoke. "The stone breathes beneath Marlowe. The smoke will rise and 27 will sink, but the crow has cried and 19 shall walk free. When the sun stands highest on the third day, let no man dig. The mountain remembers." His voice was clear, resonant, and impossibly still. Then came the words no one could understand, at least not yet. "Anawa equisat." The bones hum in the dark places, the fire beneath the coal. Several adults gasped. Miriam reached for her son, but Elias stepped away unseeing. His eyes stared straight ahead as if transfixed by something far beyond this room. "Tell them," he said. "Tell the men below. Do not wake the ones who sleep beneath the black vein. The mountain is hungry, and it remembers every hand that spilled blood where the spirits once danced." He then whispered something so softly it should not have been audible, but everyone heard it. "Debt paid in ash." And then, as if a string had been cut, Elias blinked. His eyes fluttered, and he looked around confused. He turned to his mother, voice returning to that of a normal 9-year-old. "Mama, why is everyone looking at me?" What followed was silence, so heavy it seemed to bend the timbers of the church itself. For the rest of the service, no one moved. Reverend Pike did not resume his sermon. Instead, he offered a prayer with trembling hands and dismissed the congregation with barely a word. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and crows circled above the chapel roof. Inside, every person wrestled with what they had just witnessed. By nightfall, Briar Hollow was no longer one town. It was two. There were those who believed Elias's words were a divine warning, a message from God delivered through a child too innocent to lie. And there were those who believed the devil had finally crept into their sanctuary, wearing the face of a boy they'd once called neighbor. The door cabin perched just above the creek bend became a point of quiet tension. Miriam sat with Elias by the hearth, brushing his hair gently, while outside silhouettes passed beneath their window neighbors, pretending to fetch water or firewood, but really just staring, watching. Silas, jaw clenched, said little, but he kept the axe by the door that night. In the homes below, conversation spilled late into the cold hours. Some quoted scripture. Others whispered fearfully of the old blood, a phrase long avoided, but now impossible to ignore. By morning, 3 names had emerged: Gwendolyn Pike, widow of the Reverend's brother, and a quiet force in the community believed Elias was a vessel for prophecy. Her son Arthur worked in the Marlow cleffields, and she would not ignore the boy's warning. A child doesn't speak in riddles unless something older speaks through him. She told the prayer circle that met secretly in her kitchen. Reuben Cross, the oldest man in Briar Hollow and a retired foreman of the Marlow mine, was less poetic. But he knew tunnels. He knew how they breathed, how they shifted, how they killed. He said Elias's mention of the fire beneath the coal wasn't just metaphor. It was geological. Something in the mine's lower chamber had been unstable for years. Reuben had warned them once. They hadn't listened. Then there was Dr. Horace Bellamy. The physician had arrived in Briar Hollow only 2 days earlier, summoned by Reverend Pike to assist with an outbreak of mountain fever. A tall man with rimless spectacles and a notebook never far from reach, Bellamy was fascinated by unusual cases, especially those that blurred the line between physiology and belief. He had seen transes before, fits, delusions brought on by high fever or head trauma. But what Elias had displayed didn't fit any diagnosis in his books. No seizures, no fever, no incoherence. The boy's words had structure, rhythm, intent, and that more than anything unsettled the doctor. He asked Miriam for permission to speak with the boy. She refused. Instead, she watched Elias sleep that night, fitfully curling into himself as if shielding against something unseen. Every so often he whispered in his sleep, not English, something older. By Monday evening, word had spread beyond Briar Hollow. A traveling merchant passed through with fresh supplies and carried the tale toward Marlow. At the chapel, Reverend Pike had taken to prayer. He remained inside most of the day, fasting, asking for guidance, for clarity. Because if Elias had truly been touched by God, then why had the words he spoken sounded so much like the tongue of the people Reverend Pike's ancestors had once driven from these hills 3 days? That was the time given in Elias's strange pronouncement, when the sun stands highest on the 3rd day. In Briar Hollow, time didn't pass by clocks. It passed by the position of the sun on the ridgeline, the color of the creek water, the sound of wind whistling through bare trees. And for 3 days, everything in town felt off. The morning after Elias's prophecy, Reuben Cross woke before dawn and began packing. He didn't say much, but by the time the sun cleared the treetops, his mare was saddled and his saddlebag stocked. He was heading for Marlow. 20 miles of snow-covered mountain trail, most of it steep and narrow, and all of it dangerous. When his neighbor asked him why, Reuben simply said, "That boy don't know how to lie." Not with eyes like his. Gwendolyn Pike spent that day writing letters. One for her son Arthur, who worked the Wednesday shift at Marlow's lower chamber. Another she sealed and handed to Reverend Pike with trembling hands. "If I'm wrong," she said, "then it's just paper. But if I'm right," he didn't open it. He placed it in the chapel drawer beside his Bible. Dr. Bellamy, meanwhile, requested to observe Elias directly, but again, Miriam refused. Instead, the physician sat by the Dorne cabin each afternoon, notebook in hand, logging every movement of the boy from a respectful distance. What he saw disturbed him. Elias was quiet, but not calm. He paced the floor with slow, almost ritualistic movements. He would often stop and look to the south, where the hills dipped toward the unseen town of Marlow. At times he would hum softly, tunelessly, in a cadence Bellamy couldn't identify. And then there were the whispers. Elias would pause mid-step and tilt his head as if listening to a voice only he could hear. Sometimes he nodded. Once Bellamy swore he saw the boy smile faintly, then shudder as if the smile had not been his own. In the rest of Briar Hollow, the waiting turned into quiet panic. Fathers who worked odd jobs in Marlow debated whether to make the journey that week. Mothers held their children closer, pulling them from play early and locking doors for no reason other than dread. Children whispered about Elias, some calling him Ghost Boy, others avoiding him entirely. Inside the chapel, the pews remained half-filled. Some came to pray, others just sat in silence, needing the structure of belief to hold something, anything together. And Elias. On Tuesday night, Miriam found him standing barefoot in the snow outside their cabin, staring at the sky. His eyes reflected the moonlight in a way that made her breath catch. "It's loud," he said softly. "Down there. So many of them walking where they shouldn't." Miriam wrapped him in a blanket and brought him inside, but Elias did not sleep. He muttered in his bed, his hands clenched, his body tense as a drawn wire. At one point he whispered, "The crows have flown. The door's already open." And when she asked what he meant, Elias just blinked slowly and said, "They're going too deep. The stone doesn't like it. The fire is hungry." Wednesday, February 21st, 1883. The day the mountain answered. It began with a stillness that didn't feel holy, but hollow. The kind of unnatural calm that comes before something breaks. The sun rose without a cloud in sight, casting long blades of gold through the leafless trees. In the door cabin, Elias sat at the window without speaking, his breath fogging the glass. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't moved much, only watched. Across Briar Hollow, people carried on as if it were any other winter day. But everything was quieter. Children didn't play outside. Woodcutters paused more often between swings. Even the dog seemed subdued, tails low, ears flat. Miriam Dorne kept one eye on the clock and one on her son. Each tick of the pendulum seemed louder than the last. At 11:40, Elias stood. He didn't speak. He just walked to the center of the room barefoot and stared at the floor. "It's starting," he whispered. 20 miles south in the coal tunnels beneath Marlow, the shift bell rang. 100 men were already underground, picks swinging, carts squealing along rusted rails. The new section of tunnel recently reopened for deeper excavation had drawn particular excitement. Word was the seam ran thick with coal and might even expose deeper mineral veins. Reuben Cross had arrived at the mine just after dawn, half frozen and horsero from riding through the night. He hadn't expected anyone to take him seriously, but when he invoked the name of Elias Dorne, something shifted in the mine superintendent's face. "That boy," the man said, "he's the one they say speaks in riddles." Reuben nodded. "He's also the one who gave me the number 19. By some miracle, they listened." 19 workers, those assigned to the newly blasted tunnel, were pulled up just after 11. At exactly 12:16 p.m., the mountain moved, not with a tremor, not with a quake, but with a crack. A deep, gut-shaking rupture that echoed through the hills like the groan of something ancient waking from sleep. The ground in Briar Hollow jolted. Crockery fell. A barn door came unhinged. A chimney stone toppled near the chapel and smashed into the frozen earth. And then came the sound. A low rolling roar from the south like distant thunder trapped underground. In the door cabin, Elias stood perfectly still. He closed his eyes and whispered, not in trance, not possessed, but as himself. "The stone has taken them. 19 were spared. 27 now dream in the dark." He didn't collapse. He didn't weep. But Miriam said something in him seemed to go quiet as if a candle inside had been snuffed. It took hours for word to reach Briar Hollow. A courier arrived just before dusk, mud-spattered, wide-eyed and breathless. He bore a telegram from Marlowe's superintendent and a note from Deputy Marshal Everett Connors, who had been on site investigating reports of claim disputes. The mine's southern tunnel had collapsed entirely. Of the workers inside, 27 were confirmed lost. Their bodies likely unrecoverable beneath the tons of fallen earth, but 19 had been above ground when it happened, evacuated only minutes before, thanks to the insistence of one old man with frostbitten fingers and a prophecy in his pocket. It was the exact number, the courier said, voice cracking. The exact damn number. That night, Briar Hollow didn't sleep. Some prayed, some wept. Some whispered Elias's name like a prayer of their own, half in awe, half in dread. Because whatever had spoken through him, it had told the truth. For the rest of the world, the Marlow collapse was just another tragedy in a long line of mining disasters. But for Briar Hollow, it was something far worse. It was a reckoning because they hadn't just seen it coming. They'd been told. Word spread fast. Faster than the snowmelt come spring. Within a day, Briar Hollow was no longer a name whispered only among traders and churchmen. It became the town with the boy who saw things. Reverend Pike said little at first. He locked himself in the chapel with his Bible and didn't emerge until Friday. When he did, his eyes were sunken and his hands shook. His next sermon, delivered to a chapel fuller than it had ever been, wasn't fire and brimstone. It was something else, something closer to fear. Sometimes, he said, the Lord speaks in ways we are not prepared to understand. And sometimes, not everything that speaks comes from heaven. He never named Elias. He didn't have to. The Dorne family became the axis around which everything turned and wobbled. Silas, never a man for attention, grew withdrawn and weary. He refused visitors. He stopped going into town altogether. Miriam tried to keep life inside the cabin as normal as possible, but Elias had changed. He no longer paced or hummed or spoke in riddles. Instead, he was quiet. Too quiet. He sat for long stretches by the hearth, staring into the embers as if waiting for something to return. He no longer played, no longer asked questions. And when Miriam gently brought up the events of Wednesday, Elias looked at her with tired eyes that didn't belong to a child. I didn't want to know, he whispered. But it came anyway. Dr. Bellamy, ever the scientist, tried to document everything. He interviewed witnesses, sketched maps, recreated timelines. He asked for access to Elias again, this time, not just to observe, but to examine. Miriam refused. Silas told him plainly that if the doctor returned, he'd be met with the axe that hung beside the door. But it wasn't just the family that was on edge. In town, the reactions fractured. Some began treating Elias like a holy vessel. They left offerings outside the door cabin, bread, wool mittens, little carved animals. One woman knelt in the snow and asked the boy to pray for her son's safe return from Charleston. Others weren't so kind. A few whispered that the prophecy hadn't been a warning, but a curse. That Elias hadn't saved 19 men, he had chosen them. Elder Jonah Crane, a firebrand from the chapel's inner circle, began circulating a petition calling for the boy's removal from Briar Hollow altogether. Whether it's of God or the devil. He said no child should have that kind of power. Even those who believed in Elias's gift couldn't agree on what to do with it. And through it all, the boy remained silent still until the next Sunday, when he stood once more in the chapel and spoke names. February 25, 1883, 1 week after the prophecy. The chapel was so crowded that morning, people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, their breath clouding in the cold air. Some had come to pray. Others had come to see. Most weren't sure which category they belonged to anymore. Elias sat beside Miriam in the front pew, bundled in a wool coat several sizes too big. He looked smaller than he had a week ago, not younger, just diminished, like a light turned low to preserve the oil. Reverend Pike began his sermon with a cracked voice reading from 1 Samuel about the boy prophet who heard God's voice in the night. It was meant to be calming, familiar. But the words never finished because Elias stood again. And this time the room didn't fall quiet. It froze. He stepped into the aisle as he had before. But his voice when it came was different. No strange cadence, no foreign tongue, just the clear, level voice of a 9-year-old boy delivering truths no child should carry. "Mrs. Karen Talbot," he said, turning his gaze to a woman seated near the back. "You buried a bottle behind the smokehouse. You think it helps you sleep, but you drink because the baby cries in your dreams." She gasped aloud. Her husband turned toward her in confusion, but she looked away, her hand covering her mouth. "Mr. Hollis, the loan you gave the Bramble family wasn't a gift. You've been charging interest, though you called it charity. God hears every coin that clicks in your pocket." A murmur spread. People shifted. Some stepped back from those being named as if sin might be contagious. "Reverend Pike." The air tightened. "You lied about Charleston. There was no council meeting. You went to see your brother. You told no one he was dying. You wept on his bedside and told him you didn't believe anymore." "Not really." The Reverend staggered a step back from the pulpit. No one moved to help him. Then Elias turned. "Dr. Bellamy." The room stilled. "You came to study me. But you've studied others. The man with the trembling hands in Charleston. The girl who couldn't stop screaming after her brother drowned. You touched their minds and called it medicine. How many didn't wake up?" Bellamy's face went pale. He said nothing. He couldn't because it was true. His treatments in Charleston had been experimental, dangerous, unauthorized, and one had ended in death. Elias's eyes scanned the room once more, and then his voice dropped soft but unmistakable. "I didn't ask to know, but now I can't unknow. Your secrets scratch at my bones like mice in the walls, and they won't stop. Not until they're spoken." He looked down at his own hands. "I'm tired." And then he collapsed. Not violently, not dramatically, just folded to the floor like a doll with the strings cut. Miriam screamed and rushed to him. Bellamy followed. His pulse was strong, breathing steady, but Elias was unresponsive, his eyes fluttering behind closed lids, his lips moving faintly as if still speaking to someone or something. Outside the chapel, snow had begun to fall, the kind that melts on contact, heavy, wet, cleansing. But inside, no one felt clean because in the space of 5 minutes, the boy had torn open their walls. Not of stone, of conscience. The town cracked open like rotted wood. Within hours of the service, Briar Hollow was no longer whispering. It was unraveling. The chapel that had once held the town together now stood like a wound, its doors shut, windows dark. Reverend Pike retreated into silence. He did not leave his quarters for 3 days. Mrs. Talbot, whose name was the first Elias had spoken, packed what she could carry by sundown and left for Charleston with her sister. She did not look at her husband once while boarding the wagon. Some say she never forgave him for the silence he kept. Others say she simply couldn't live in a place where her grief had been made public. Mr. Hollis denied everything, loudly, violently. But by week's end, 3 men who had taken loans from him came forward with ledgers and receipts. His shop was shuttered soon after, and Reverend Pike. He did not deny the boy's words. He couldn't. Those who visited him in the following days said his eyes were sunken, his sermons unfinished. He continued preaching, but something had shifted in him. He quoted fewer scriptures and more questions. His voice lost its fire. What remained was a man uncertain whether he had spent a lifetime serving God or waiting for him to speak and finally hearing it from a child. But it was Dr. Bellamy who faced the harshest mirror. He did not sleep that Sunday night. Instead, he sat alone in the small lodging behind the infirmary, reading over his notes on Elias until he reached the section he had deliberately left vague. Charleston, patient number 4, the girl with the seizures. Elias had known, not just the result, but the intention. You touched their minds and called it medicine, the boy had said. Bellamy's colleagues in Charleston had long suspected the truth. Elias had simply named it, stripped it bare. By Wednesday, the doctor requested an audience with the Dornes. Silas refused, but Miriam allowed it. Elias sat beside the fire, his knees drawn to his chest, eyes distant. "I never meant harm," Bellamy said, his voice low. "Only understanding." Elias didn't look at him. "But understanding didn't ask you to keep going," the boy replied. "You did that part on your own." The doctor wept. For the first time in years in the community, a strange quiet took hold, not of peace, but of stunned reformation. People avoided the chapel. Some avoided each other. Friendships cooled. Marriages trembled. The air in Briar Hollow was no longer laced with smoke and pine. It smelled like truth. And truth, it turns out, doesn't settle easily. Children were kept indoors. Doors stayed locked. Offerings at the door cabin stopped, replaced now with glances, some reverent, others fearful. But the most pressing concern wasn't the town. It was Elias. Because ever since the second prophecy, the boy had begun to change. His sleep grew shallow. His body weakened. His hands trembled when he tried to lift a spoon. Miriam tended to him constantly. Silas rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always the same. "He's slipping." Elias didn't deny it. One night he whispered to his mother, "Every time it happens, something stays behind and something in me gets left out there." She tried to ask what out there meant, but Elias just looked at the fire and didn't answer. Dr. Horace Bellamy had come to Briar Hollow seeking an explanation. What he found was obsession. After Elias's second prophetic episode, the physician made a decision quietly, resolutely. If the boy's mind truly held a key to something beyond current science, then he would be the one to unlock it. He began visiting the Dorne cabin daily under the pretense of concern. At first, Miriam allowed it. Elias still trusted the doctor in a way that children sometimes trust those who've seen them break and didn't look away. But Bellamy's questions changed. They became sharper, more specific. He brought with him strange devices, brass-tipped rods, scented oils, even a tuning fork, which he struck near Elias's ears to observe his response to pitch and vibration. He claimed it was to test neurological sensitivity. Elias endured it until he didn't. On the fifth day, the boy recoiled from the doctor's hand, eyes wide, not in fear, but in some deeper, bone-deep knowing. "You're not looking for answers," he said. "You're looking for control." Bellamy didn't deny it. Instead, he asked, "Do you know what you are, Elias?" The boy didn't blink. "I'm the door. You're the hand trying to pry it open." That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat upright in his bed, rocking slightly, whispering things Miriam couldn't make out. His skin felt warm to the touch, but he wasn't feverish. His pulse was erratic. His eyes darted behind closed lids like someone dreaming while awake. Miriam begged Silas to stop the doctor's visits. Silas agreed, but it was too late. Bellamy had already begun recording the results of unofficial experiments. Light exposure, sensory stimulation, even dietary changes. He was convinced Elias's visions were a form of cognitive overstimulation unlocked by trauma and reinforced by isolation. He documented everything except the boy's decline. On March 2nd, Elias entered another trance unprovoked, unprompted, but this time he didn't speak of others. He spoke of himself. "The fire is under my skin now," he said, eyes open, but unfocused. "And the stone has memorized my name." Miriam fell to her knees beside him. "Elias," she whispered. "What are you seeing?" The boy raised a trembling hand. "A white room, your voice, but far away. I'm on a table. Something's inside my head." And then nothing. Then his voice changed. It dropped an octave. It became calm. Chillingly calm. "Tell the doctor the choice is coming. He can keep digging. But if he goes further, he'll bury me. The mountain doesn't give second warnings." Then silence. And when Elias slumped forward, Miriam caught him before his head hit the floor. Bellamy returned that evening demanding to see the boy. Silas answered the door with an axe over his shoulder and words too bitter to repeat. But before shutting the door in his face, he said one thing. You're the one he warned about. That night, Bellamy stayed awake in the infirmary, staring at his medical journal, the pages trembling in his hands. The boy's visions weren't just symptoms. They were messages, and the next message he feared would come at a cost far greater than truth. March 5, 1883. The sun rose behind a veil of low clouds, casting no warmth on the snow, damp ground. The hills around Briar Hollow seemed quieter than usual. Even the crows had gone still. Inside the door cabin, Elias lay motionless. His breathing was shallow. His skin, pale and waxing, seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. Miriam had not left his side in 2 days. He hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken. His eyes remained closed, though sometimes his lips moved fragments of words only he could hear. Reverend Pike came by twice to pray. On the second visit, he wept, but just before noon, Elias stirred. His fingers twitched. His mouth opened, not in a gasp, but in a whisper that reached the corners of the room like smoke. The table is cold. Miriam leaned close. What, sweetheart? Elias's eyes fluttered open. Not fully, just enough to reveal that distant glazed look that meant the visions had returned. He's standing over me, Elias murmured. The straps are too tight. He wants to see what happens if he pushes deeper. Miriam froze. Elias's voice grew steadier, stronger. There's a light above my face, something metal in his hand, and his whispering just a little further. She tried to wake him to shake him free, but he didn't blink. The mountain is watching, and it doesn't blink either. It counts debts. It measures silence, and it knows when mercy has been buried beneath curiosity. Then his voice changed again. Not deeper, not louder, but older, as if something ancient had borrowed the boy's throat. Dr. Bellamy. A pause. The room felt colder. You wanted truth, but truth is not yours to hold. You thought the mind was clay and this child a vessel. But the vessel cracks, and when it does, what leaks out will not be light. Silas stepped into the room just as Elias uttered the final words. The next push will be the last. Choose knowledge or mercy, because both cannot survive the night. Then Elias collapsed back into unconsciousness, his breath rattling. Silas looked at Miriam. It's time. They didn't send for Bellamy. Instead, it was the doctor who came uninvited just after sundown, journal in hand. Ice Hollow, he had heard. Word traveled fast in Briar Hollow now, especially when it came to the boy. Miriam met him at the door. He's sleeping. Bellamy nodded. I need to see him. She didn't move. You heard what he said. The doctor swallowed hard. Yes. He looked past her toward the dark room beyond. And he's right. I was willing to trade his soul for a page in a book. His voice broke, but no more. He stepped back from the threshold. Take care of him if there's still something left to save. He left without another word. That night, for the first time in days, Elias slept soundly. No murmurs, no movement, just breath. Slow and steady. Dr. Horace Bellamy left Briar Hollow 2 mornings later. No one saw him off. He packed quietly, returned the infirmary keys to Reverend Pike, and wrote out just after dawn. He left behind a leather-bound journal filled with notes, some clinical, some frantic. At the end of the final entry, he had written, "The mind of a child should not be asked to carry the weight of heaven or hell. I came seeking explanation and left with only shame. Let no one follow me down this road." He never returned, and for a while, Briar Hollow exhaled. The town didn't heal exactly, but it softened. The fear gave way to silence. Doors opened again. Children returned to the snow-covered fields. People still avoided the chapel, but they nodded to one another in the streets. It was enough. Elias recovered slowly. He woke on the 3rd day after the vision, thinner, quieter, but lucid. Miriam cried. Silas held him longer than he ever had before. The boy no longer hummed, no longer stared into empty corners, but he also no longer heard. Not the whispers, not the voices, not the mountain. Whatever had spoken through him had gone quiet. At first they feared the silence, expected it to be temporary, that the next moon, the next storm, the next tremor would bring it back. But it didn't. And as the days passed, it became clear that Elias wasn't just recovering, he was changing. He smiled again. He asked questions. He played with sticks in the snow. The furrow between his brows, always present since infancy, softened. But something in him was gone, not lost, spent. By spring, Reverend Pike had resumed sermons, but they were shorter now, softer. He spoke less of judgment, more of uncertainty, and people listened differently, as if they knew now that understanding might not come in words, but in silence. Mrs. Talbot returned alone. She moved into her sister's spare room and resumed tending the chapel garden. She never spoke of her departure. As for the townspeople, who once called Elias cursed, they fell quiet, too. Some avoided the dorms. Others brought food or mended fences without saying a word. And Elias, he never again entered a trance. The dreams faded. The languages disappeared. But he began to develop a different kind of gift, one rooted not in prophecy, but perception. He could sense when a storm would break. He could feel when the ground was too soft for planting. He guided travelers through fog by following birds. He listened to the world the way a hunter listens to the wind. He no longer spoke for the mountain, but he still heard it breathe. Elias Dorne grew up slowly and quietly. He was never the most talkative boy in Briar Hollow, nor the strongest. But people began to notice something about him, something different from the strange light that had once flared so brightly then vanished. He had a way of knowing things, not in visions, not in tongues, but in understanding. He could read the land like scripture. He knew when a tree was ready to fall before it leaned. He warned families to move livestock before an early frost. And more than once, he led a search party straight to a lost traveler without compass, without lantern, just a hand held steady above the earth. Some said it was instinct, others left over prophecy. But Elias never claimed anything. He just said, sometimes the mountain talks. You just have to listen without needing to understand. He never returned to the chapel, though he helped repair its roof after a windstorm. He never revisited the spot where the prophecy had been spoken, though he walked the trails nearby with a calm that unnerved some and comforted others. He became a surveyor, a mapmaker, the best in the region. His lines were clean, his routes efficient. But what truly made him invaluable was how he could read the terrain. He'd walk into dense forest, run his fingers over a patch of lichen, and say, "Don't dig here. Water runs under it." And he'd be right. By the time he was 23, he had mapped every hill within 30 miles of Briar Hollow. He married Lenora Pike, the Reverend's niece, one of the few who had never looked at him with fear, even as a child. They had 3 children, none of whom spoke in strange voices or saw shadows others couldn't. And maybe that was the greatest mercy of all. Elias never spoke of the visions. When asked, he'd just smile politely and say, "That was another life." But late one autumn evening, when his youngest asked why he always carried a stone from the ridge in his coat pocket, he answered, "To remind me that some things don't speak in words. And just because it's quiet doesn't mean it's gone." When his own mother Miriam passed, Elias carved her headstone by hand. It bore no verse, just her name and the outline of a crow's feather etched into the granite. He buried Silas 3 winters later beside her. He didn't cry during the service, but afterward he sat by their graves until the snow had covered his boots. When someone asked what he was doing, he simply said, "Listening." And no one questioned it. Time passed as it always does. Buildings aged. People came and went. Roads widened. The world beyond Briar Hollow grew louder, faster, more connected. But inside the hollow, something held, something quiet. The town never grew much. It never needed to. Those who stayed did so not because they feared the world, but because they had learned to respect what the world often forgets. That not everything true can be explained. The events of 1883 were not spoken of often, but they were never entirely forgotten either. They lived in the small things, like how children were taught to listen before they spoke, or how maps of the region always bore subtle markers around Marlow, even though the mine itself had long since collapsed and vanished from official records. The old entrance remained sealed, grown over with brush and blackberry thorns. No one dared dig there, not out of fear exactly, but out of understanding. They remembered the boy and the mountain that listened. Reverend Pike lived to an old age. His later sermons became less about certainty, more about mystery. In one of his final homilies, he said, "I once believed that revelation came with thunder. Now I know it more often comes with silence." He never publicly confirmed or denied Elias's gift. But those close to him knew his prayers changed after 1883. He stopped asking for answers. He started asking for mercy. The children of Briar Hollow grew up in a town shaped by something unspoken. They played beneath trees that once marked the edge of the prophecy. They carved initials in defense posts Elias had built. Some asked their parents about the boy who saw things, and depending on who answered, the stories varied. Some called him a prophet. Some called him broken. But most just called him Elias. And in a way that was enough, because while the rest of the world chased miracles that shouted, Briar Hollow had learned to honor the ones that whispered. Once a year on the anniversary of the Marlow collapse, a few families would still walk the ridge at midday, not to mourn, not even to remember, just to stand still for a moment. And listen, Elias Dorne died in the winter of 1926. There was no headline, no spectacle, just a short note in the Briar Hollow register. Elias Dorne, 52, mapmaker. Beloved husband, father of 3, known for his kindness and his uncanny way of reading the hills. He passed peacefully in his sleep with a hand resting over his heart, and the stone from the ridge still tucked inside his coat pocket. They buried him beside Miriam and Silas beneath a tree that hadn't bloomed in years, but did that spring. Lenora placed a simple marker at his grave. He listened. No one spoke of prophecy at his funeral. But after the service, several older folk stood in silence along the southern ridge, facing the long-forgotten entrance to the Marlow mine. The wind was soft that day. The mountain was still, but it was listening. In the decades that followed, Elias's story faded into something between legend and memory. Some said he had been gifted, others that he had simply been broken in a way that made him more attuned to danger. A few believed he had been chosen. But the truth was far stranger. Elias had seen us clearly, not just the disasters to come, but the quiet faults we tried to bury, the lies we told ourselves, the debts we never wanted to pay. And he spoke them aloud, not to punish, not to shame, but because he couldn't help it. It was never a gift. It was a burden. One he carried until it emptied him. In time, scholars came to Briar Hollow looking for records. Historians, psychologists, theologists. They found a few fragments, letters, journals, one surviving entry from Dr. Bellamy's casebook preserved in a university archive. It read, "What I saw in that child was not delusion. It was not divine. It was the human mind stretched to its most fragile edge where memory and blood and silence converge." The Marlow collapse remained one of the deadliest mining accidents in the state's history. 19 were saved. 27 were not. No one ever reopened the mine. Not because of safety, because of respect. The kind of respect that comes from knowing that sometimes the land doesn't want to be asked again. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone warns you before it's too late. So maybe the story of Elias Dorne isn't about prophecy at all. Maybe it's about listening to the world, to each other, to ourselves. Even when the words don't make sense, even when they come from the mouths of children, because sometimes the most terrifying truths don't come screaming. They arrive quiet, soft-spoken, wearing a small coat and pale eyes that have seen too much. And when they do, we can choose to turn away, or we can choose to